welcome. It's 1 o'clock, so I think we'll make a start. Gosh. So welcome to all of our wonderful sort of face-to-face delegates. We also have a large virtual attendee, which is fantastic. So welcome to all of our virtual attendees as well for what I think is going to be a really interesting, I hope, discussion and wider reflection on looking at mental health in the workplace. So just to get us started, I'll sort of hand over to Professor Simon Teasdale, who's our Director of Research.
Thanks, Juliet. I thought I was introducing you, so this is going to go round in circles a little bit now, but yeah, so welcome all to Queen's Business School. Our mission is to educate and explore for the benefit of business and society. I could sit here for the next half an hour and tell you how brilliant Queen's is, but instead I'm going to let Juliet demonstrate that through the event she's organised. So Juliet's passionate about mental health in the workplace, and her research takes a particular angle on this and makes the business case for it. She's absolutely fantastic. She's organised all this today, and over the next 2 hours you're going to hear from some world-leading scholars, industry people and policymakers and have a chance to discuss and learn from each other about how to improve mental health and well-being in the workplace. I'll now pass over to one of those world-leading scholars, Stephen Roper, who's Director of the Enterprise Research Centre and Professor at Warwick University. So have a great time while you're here.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Stephen Roper, and I'm the lead investigator on this project, which is investigating the links between workplace mental health, well-being and productivity. I hope you have a great event this afternoon, and I'm sorry I can't be with you, but I'm committed to a PhD event in Sheffield today, so I have to be there. This project is a collaboration between colleagues here at Warwick with researchers at Nottingham, Queen's University Belfast and University College Cork. It brings together psychologists, management researchers and occupational health researchers to look at the complex issues which link workplace mental health, well-being and productivity. The project is being supported by the Economic and Social Research Council as part of a portfolio of projects looking at the factors which influence workplace productivity across the UK. Other related projects include the Northern Ireland Productivity Forum of the Productivity Institute, which have done some great work around the relationship between management practices and productivity, and you may have heard about this work before in the media. I know you'll find this afternoon inspiring. I hope you find some positive takeaways for your own organisation in the conversation this afternoon, and I look forward to hearing all about it in due course. I hope you enjoy the event. Thank you.
Brilliant. So with that, I guess I'm going to start by talking a little bit about the business case for mental health at work, and in particular, exploring what we understand and what we know in terms of the costs, but I hope also to sort of expand that discussion a little bit in terms of thinking about what some of the benefits and drivers may be for us to think about mental health and psychological wellness in the workplace. So I wanted to start my presentation by kind of grounding us in effectively the why. Why are we interested in exploring mental health? And I think a useful starting off point is for us to consider the scale of mental ill health within the context of the workplace. So these are some figures from the Health and Safety Executive, and gives us a wider trend in terms of the cases of stress, depression, and anxiety. So nearly half of all work-related health issues in 2022 to 2023 were due to stress, depression, and anxiety. If we look at that bar chart, I think what's really kind of jumps off the digital page, if you will, is this kind of gray column. And the gray column gives us a sense of what was happening in terms of mental health within the COVID period. And what we can see is from that time period, there's a huge sort of jump up, a big escalation when we look at mental ill health within the context of the working population. Now, we know, looking at more recent data, that these numbers remain high and about 2.5% higher pre-pandemic levels than what we saw prior to that in terms of cases of mental ill health. So I think the real take home is we've seen an escalation, we've seen a trend upwards, and probably not really surprisingly, even as we come out of this COVID period, these rates remain high. With that in mind, we can see that the scale is notable. If we place that within the context of the workplace, we have estimates between 1 in 4 to 1 in 6 workers will experience a mental health challenge within their working lives. It leads us to then start to think, well, what is the implications of that, or how does that translate within the context of the workplace? So we know that about 31.5 million days working days are lost each year globally due to work-related ill health. If we look down specifically in terms of stress, depression, anxiety, this equates to just over half. So 17.1 million working days are lost annually due to stress, depression, and anxiety. On average, each person suffering with stress, depression, anxiety took just shy of about 20 days of leave from work. So this is starting to build for us a kind of a wider picture of what the implications are from an employer perspective. But how do we situate that within kind of an economic form of estimate? So on these bar charts, you can see these are estimates from Deloitte in terms of looking at the cost of mental ill health from an employer perspective. They have two key costs, one coming from 2019 and a more recent one from 2021. So it gives us a little bit of a picture pre-pandemic and during the pandemic. Currently, the most recent estimate we have is that the cost of mental ill health from an employer perspective ranges between 53 to 56 billion per year, equating to about 2.6 of the UK's annual gross domestic product. So the cost is really significant. And if we think about that in terms of pre-pandemic to during the pandemic, we see an increase of about 25% of these costs. And that's maybe not a big surprise when we think about that upward trends in terms of mental ill health in the context of the workplace. If we look at the bar charts, I think what becomes really remarkable is we can see a very stark difference when we look at staff turnover. So this is probably where we see the most notable difference between pre- and pandemic periods. In 2019, about 8.6% of that cost, or not percent, sorry, billion was coming from staff turnover. During the pandemic, that rose to 22.4 billion. So I think for me, the real take-home message is during that time period, I think a lot of people were making a choice in terms of leaving organizations, maybe leaving professions, and that may be for a wide, complex reason around sort of mental health and well-being. The other thing that's really notable about that bar chart is what is the most significant of those three cost components. Sickness absence, we've just talked about turnover, but we can also talk about presenteeism. And that's attending work despite being ill and employees not performing to their full ability. Saying that another way, we've got individuals who are coming to work, but their productivity is reduced. It's probably what I would call the invisible cost to employers. It's easy for us in some ways to have measures around sickness absence. A lot of organizations do. We may even have useful metrics around turnover. But what we have here is a really prevalent cost. It is the largest of these three cost components. But it's much harder for employers to really see and measure presenteeism or really have a full appreciation of its economic impact from a business perspective. So the estimates based on Deloitte is that presenteeism is about 4 to 4.5 times more economically costly than sickness absences. So I hope that I've sort of started to paint a picture of the cost of mental ill health at work. But I kind of wanted to take a little bit of a step back and go, well, what is mental health? And if we look at the definition from the World Health Organization, it says mental health is a state of mental well-being that enables people to cope with the stresses of life, realize their abilities, learn, and work well. So if we think about that, what mental health is it's a resource. It's a resource for us to accomplish the goals that we want in life in order to perform optimally, to be creative, to be innovative in the context of the workplace. So while I was painting a picture of the cost of mental ill health, the cost of doing nothing, the cost of, dare I say, stressful work environments, we might want to expand that picture a little bit. So what I want to do is to present to you an ad that's been fairly recently, you may have come across it.
Boss being a meanie. Too bad. Shut up. Listen, I've got some important news. It turns out that I'm not the deadliest thing in the office. This is. It's a killer. Science has shown it can be bad for your mental health. But I don't see you running away from it. No, your boss says you're locked to it for 8, 9, 10 hours a day. Look at you, trading your own mental health for free fruit and a wellness Wednesday? Banana, anyone? The fruit. Wake up, geniuses. I'm giving you the truth. It's a trap. You need to get away from your desk. Run, jump, roller skate, whatever, I don't care. Just move for your mind.
Interesting points. I think for me, one of the things when I first saw this advert that I spent a lot of time reflecting on was a lot of the ethos of this advert, and maybe it's a wider picture of the discourse around mental health at work, is about how the workplace harms. It's a focus being chained to your desk. Instead of us having a conversation about how the work environment, work, can be health enhancing, can be health cultivating. And so for me, looking at this recent advert, it sort of underpinned the importance of us moving the discourse and the dialogue away exclusively from mental ill health to us talking about mental health as a resource for living well, working well, optimization, flourishing. And with that, I think that becomes really important when we think about this from a business case perspective. So the picture that I've painted to you before was, what's the cost of doing nothing? What's the cost of when we harm people? What's the cost of mental ill health? But I think what we're not asking the question as significantly is, what is the strategic business advantages? What are the economic benefits of when we get it right? And when we move people along that mental health continuum. So if we think about those in tandem, we know that mental health runs on a spectrum where we might talk about one end of that being depression, anxiety, burnout, stress, strain, all of that. But we can also talk about what that looks like on the other end of the spectrum. Innovation, creativity, engagement, satisfaction, resiliency. Equally, when we think about performance and productivity, of course, we can think about that on a continuum as well. On the one side, we can talk about this as reduced workforce capacity, retention, increased turnover. Conversely, we can look at the other side of the continuum and talk about this as innovation, creativity, organizational citizenship behaviors, doing the above and beyond in the workplace. And so in some sense, if we only think about the business case being situated and underpinned by what are the productivity losses of ill health and harm, we're missing a really important additional component to that argument, which what are the productivity gains that we get and we accrue from psychological wellness in the workplace, from mental health in the workplace, so that resource for living, thriving. And what we know, although it's a small evidence base, but it's a growing evidence base, that tells us, yes, there are economic benefits for investing in people's health and well-being. So not just about when we get it wrong and when we harm or ill health, but actually when we're investing in psychological wellness, broader ideas to do with employee well-being, we can see that there are economic benefits and, dare I say, business advantages. So Deloitte tells us that for every pound we invest, we anticipate getting about a 5-fold return on investment when we invest in employee mental health. Recent systematic reviews have kind of quite clearly indicated that, yes, when we invest in health and well-being in the workforce, there are economic benefits to doing that. And some of our recent research, funded by the Productivity Institute and led by Professor Holly Blake at Nottingham, found that actually for organizations that invest in training their line managers on mental health, this is associated with a wide spectrum of organizational outcomes. So reduced presenteeism, reduced absenteeism, better customer satisfaction, wide host. So a really compelling argument for us to move some of the discourse and dialogue into why should we want people to flourish and thrive at work, not just about harming them. So with that, I'll kind of conclude and then hand over to my colleague. I think to boost business success, we need to move beyond focusing solely on the cost of mental ill health and stressful and harmful work environments. To instead, we should emphasize the economic benefits and strategic business advantages of psychological wellness achieved through creating supportive, people-centered work environments. And so I think for me, as we build the business case, and I hope we'll continue the conversation throughout today's event, and I hope continue to add to that evidence base, that we can start to build a really compelling picture for the investment in creating work environments that are fundamentally psychologically healthy and safe, and that allow all individuals to thrive and flourish within them. So with that, I'll hand over to my colleague, Dr. Louise Thompson, who's going to talk about some of the research within this program, specifically looking at the implementation of workplace mental health interventions.
Thank you so much, Juliet, for that introduction, and I'm really pleased and honoured to be invited to talk to you today about the research that we're doing as part of this study, and also I'd like to acknowledge the contributions, the large contribution that my colleague Dr. Craig Bartle has contributed to this work in terms of collecting all the data and doing all the analysis what I'm going to be presenting. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about some of the workplace mental health interventions that are being highlighted in the work that we're doing as part of this ESRC project. And some of the barriers and facilitators to actually putting them into practice in workplaces. And I want to start actually by referring to some of the work that Stephen Roper and Maria Wishart at Warwick have been doing, which is based on a very large survey of HR professionals in firms. So I'm just to really give you an idea of the kind of range of workplace mental health initiatives that we're talking about, really. So they've been doing, over a number of years, large-scale surveys of employers, and in the latest round in 2023, they've done a comparison between Sweden, England, and Ireland in terms of the types of mental health and well-being initiatives that those organisations in those countries are actually adopting and implementing in the workplace. And you can see here it's quite large samples of firms, so 784 firms in Sweden, 970 in England, and 722 in Ireland. And the kind of, we can cluster these mental health and well-being practices around 4 different kinds of themes. So the first theme is around strategic policy and initiatives. So things like that include using data to monitor mental health and well-being practices, having kind of nominated and specific roles as mental health champions, having a mental health budget as part of their initiative so they can draw on some resources in relation to mental health initiatives, having a mental health lead at board level, and having a mental health plan. And you can see some differences in the data that is emerging from this survey that Maria and Stephen are leading on. In terms of the Swedish companies, are particularly high on some of these, high levels of usage of these from the Swedish firms that they're collecting data from. The second kind of cluster of kinds of initiatives on the right-hand side here are the adoption of skills training and monitoring. So training and support for those who are returning from, to work, having experienced mental health problems. The use of risk assessments and stress audits as a kind of annual or a regular part of their review of what's happening in the organisation. training for line managers in managing mental health, and also training in terms of awareness for staff with mental health issues. And again, we see a kind of range of different levels of take-up in relation to these kinds of practices. The third cluster of kinds of initiatives are investments in employee well-being that are maybe a little bit more focused on the individual. So focusing on giving some treatments or initiatives that the individual can access. So that can be support for physical activities, just as the advert there was with the trainers. Other brands of trainers are available, I would just like to point out. So, gym memberships, cycle to work schemes, also providing employees with access to counselling support, training aimed at building personal resilience, but also other kinds of aspects of well-being, so financial well-being advice, which can also be a kind of big stressor for people, and supplying healthy food and drinks. And I think that's my favourite part of that advert, Juliet, is the roti banana on the desk. And then the fourth cluster of kinds of initiatives are adoption of workplace practices to try to reduce risk factors. And this is important because this is the area where we may be able to be more preventative and support that more proactive element of the continuum where we're promoting good workplace. So allowing people to have a regular conversation about their health and well-being with their manager, making sure that they have things in place to maybe prevent poor mental health is important, making appropriate workplace adjustments to those who need them, and encouraging open conversations about mental health in the workplace. So this just to really give you a flavour of some of the kinds of mental health and well-being initiatives that we're talking about. And that the broader study is looking at. But what we do know, and what all the evidence tells us, is that you can't just choose some of these kinds of initiatives and put them into practice in your workplace and expect them to be effective. It's not so much what you do, but in many ways, it's about how you do it. Implementation is really important. And there's quite a lot of research that has shown that you can have a really effective workplace mental health and well-being initiative that works in one company, but it fails to work in another setting. And that's often because it's not implemented effectively. So I'm just quickly going to run over some of the common barriers and facilitators to effective implementation of these types of interventions. And there have been 3 recent reviews on this, and these articles are just mentioned here, trying to bring together what we currently know about what could be the barriers and facilitators to effective implementation of those kinds of initiatives in the workplace. So in terms of facilitating their effectiveness, being able to adapt them to the context of your particular business and being able to schedule them appropriately is a really important factor. So having that kind of flexibility to adapt, to tailor, to schedule is important. The credibility of the intervention itself, the evidence it's based on, what you kind of know about its validity and its effectiveness elsewhere is important. Also, what's important is the credibility of the person delivering it. So you can have the same intervention delivered in different organizations by different people, and it will have very different levels of effectiveness. So there's a lot of variation that can occur based on who is delivering it and how. Governance of these initiatives and continuity of the delivery structures is really critical. So just kind of implementing it once and kind of letting it just happen doesn't work very well. It has to be governed, it has to be led, and there has to be continuity. And that requires buy-in and support from our senior leaders and people in key strategic roles. Not just support to get it going and to say, I really believe in this and this is what we should all be doing, but that support that continues over time as well. And something that's increasingly being found to be important is the own personal experience and awareness and understanding of senior managers in those kinds of roles. That their own kind of lived experience or their understanding, maybe based on their own situation or those around them, can be a really important lever to effective implementation of workplace mental health interventions. Some of the barriers to implementing these interventions we know are things that we have come to expect over the years that are still present. So stigma being one. So the stigma associated with having a mental health condition or experiencing kind of symptoms of poor mental health is still a big issue, and it's a big issue maybe for certain groups, certain sectors, more than for others. So there's a lot of variation, and there are pockets in employment where I think the stigma is still there and still high, and I'm sure you can all think of examples. And related to that is concerns around confidentiality. People do fear that if they raise or mention that they have mental health problems, that this won't necessarily, or experiencing symptoms, that this won't necessarily remain confidential. Leaders and line managers are so critical in facilitating, but they can also act as really large barriers, really throw a spanner in the works of mental health initiatives. If they don't want them to work, or they are against other agendas, then they can make it very difficult. And this partly relates to the fourth point here, that there can be conflicts between mental health and well-being interventions and other existing processes and policies and procedures. And the reviews that have suggested these, the facilitators, do talk about how we need more evidence on where those conflicts exist and how can organizations manage those conflicts. How can we navigate where mental health and well-being interventions that promote that mental health continuum, the positives, if they're in conflict with other things, how can we navigate that and how can we address that appropriately? And the last barrier that's been identified is insufficient time to participate in these interventions. If people feel like they're chained to their desk and they're not able to engage in some of these things, maybe that's training, or accessing counselling, or engaging in those other activities. If they haven't got sufficient time and they're kind of not given permission, or just feel like they can't make time for it, then that can be another barrier. So this is the kind of picture that's emerged to date from the evidence about some of those common barriers and facilitators. But as part of this ongoing study funded by the ESRC, we've had the opportunity to look at some of these issues in a bit more detail, in some more depth, picking up on what we've learned to date, and explore in particular the role of context in these issues. So this is just a brief overview of our case study. Our study, which is around case study organizations. So we are selecting, or have selected, 10 organizations to work with and look at in depth to really understand in their specific contexts what are those barriers and facilitators and other factors which may affect how they adopt and implement some of those mental health and well-being initiatives that I mentioned at the start. So within our selection of these 10 case study organizations, we are trying to take what we call a purposive sampling approach. We're trying to deliberately get a range of different types of organizations in different sectors and of different sizes to try and really understand the role of these different contexts in understanding these barriers and facilitators. Within each case study, we're interviewing a range of different stakeholders, which includes mental health wellbeing leads, senior managers, and some employees. And we're using interviews, in-depth interviews with them to find out about their experiences of implementing these different mental health and wellbeing initiatives. We're using an approach called thematic analysis to analyze those interviews, and we're using an implementation framework called the Consolidated Framework for Implementation Research to help us with the analysis. So I'm just going to very briefly give you a kind of a brief overview of what that implementation framework looks like. So this is a well-established and well-used framework which really sets out these 5 different domains where barriers and facilitators can exist. And this framework doesn't just come from research on mental health and well-being initiatives. This is something that's commonly used in lots of different sectors, but particularly popular in the health sector, to look at the introduction of any new initiative or complex intervention and try to understand what the barriers and facilitators might be to actually putting it into practice. So those 5 domains include things to do with the actual intervention itself, how it's designed, the evidence about it, its adaptability, its complexity, and so actually things to do with the actual initiative. Things to do with the inner setting, so that's the actual context that the organisation, within the organisation, the way that that organisation is set up, its communication channels, its culture, aspects of its infrastructure, the resources that it has available to it. There are factors related to the outer setting, so that's to do with sector factors maybe, local factors, economic, external pressures, policies and laws and so on. The role of individuals is the 4th domain, so that's the role of different people in different roles, but also their needs, their capabilities, their individual motivations and their individual skills and opportunities to implement something. And then finally, elements of the implementation, planning and process. So actually what was done? How participative was it? When we put this new initiative in, did we ask people about it? Did we get their feedback on whether we could adapt it? Did we engage them in the process in any way? So this is the broader framework that we're using to help us understand the barriers and facilitators in our case study organisations. I'm going to just now present you some of the emerging evidence based on one single case study. So this is just, we're still doing this work at the moment, so this is the findings just based on the single case study to date. But I think it's an interesting one, and I think it kind of highlights some of the things that Juliet was talking about earlier, which is about, because I think this is a good example of an organisation that is taking a really positive approach to mental well-being, about, it has a definite culture around let's get the best from our people by supporting their mental well-being in a very proactive way. So this is a small organisation with just 14 employees. They're a charity, and they support children and young people who are experiencing difficulties. In terms of their mental health and well-being initiatives that they currently have in place, they're quite interesting. So the first one they have is a self-care hour. So every week, each employee is allowed 1 hour, which they can diarise, they have control over where they put it in their diary, to do their own non-work related activity. It could be going for a walk, it could be reading, it could be doing crossword puzzles, it could be going for a coffee or doing some shopping. But it's a self-care hour. It's not their lunch break. It's a different hour, and they can do and use it for something that supports their own self-care. They also use well-being action plans, and these are quite commonly used in organisations, often called wellness action plans as well. And these are individual plans that employees write, which they can use to identify in advance of them having any particular issues, what they would consider the kind of risks, the risk factors, the things that they find stressful, the things that they kind of need to avoid to remain healthy. And within their action plan, they can also write, what their line manager might be able to do to identify when these critical factors are starting to occur, and maybe what a line manager could do or a colleague to do to help support them. So they're written down in advance is the idea, and they just kind of raise people's awareness. People get to reflect on their own kind of mental health and well-being and think about what actually is difficult for them, and they discuss them with their line managers, and their line manager then has awareness of them as well. This organisation had somebody who had a dedicated mental health and well-being role, so there was a kind of mental health and well-being lead, who oversaw the various initiatives that took place. They also had a number of whiteboard-based initiatives in their kind of social spaces. So they were a faith-based organization, and they had a prayer board, and people could write down the name of individuals that they wanted others to pray for. It could be themselves, or it could be somebody that they were maybe working with, or somebody that they knew. But it was an opportunity for them to highlight that they were experiencing challenges. They could also use it to highlight when things were going really well, successes, positive news as well, which was beneficial. They had a mental health and well-being continuum on their whiteboard, which went from I'm very well to I'm struggling. And if they wanted to let people know that they were struggling, they could put their name on that board, and it meant that they could expect an informal conversation or a colleague to come and check in on them. They also said that they had lots of other practices, what we wouldn't consider normally workplace mental health well-being initiatives, but they considered them practices where the organisation supported them to be kind of checked in about in relation to their mental health. So in team meetings, in supervisions, people were asked, how are you feeling? How are you getting on? How's your well-being? There were social events and there were communal spaces, all of which supported their sense of well-being. So even though these weren't kind of classic mental health and well-being practices, the people who were interviewed all identified these as key contributors to mental health and well-being. So when we've analysed the data for this organisation, these factors in green have all been kind of highlighted and as being really kind of key elements to their practices being implemented effectively. So there were a number around the infrastructure, the inner setting, a number around the individuals involved, and how they went around implementing these initiatives. And it was very clear that the aspect of the inner setting that, and it's easier in a small organisation, but there was a lot of a shared understanding that there was a key priority around mental health and well-being. And it was partly to do with also the fact that this was a sector that they were working in the charities and working with children and young people, and were often having discussions and working around well-being themselves. So throughout the whole inner setting, health and well-being and mental health and well-being was seen as a real priority. And this was reflected in aspects of that infrastructure. So the regularity of the team meetings, the agenda of the team meetings, the supervisions, the agenda of the supervisions, the communal spaces, and how they were set up and how they were used, all supported this focus on well-being. The communications between people in the organisation, again, focused on well-being and supported a dialogue. The use of the wellness action plans supported this openness and this communication so it was a constant, that there was concern shown, people were checked in on, and there was an openness in terms of how people communicated about mental health. Individuals were key to these elements as well. So the CEO was completely bought into the importance of mental health and well-being. There were mid-level leaders who were given a specific role around the mental health and well-being lead, and there were others who took on kind of implementation leads or particular kind of focus on one of the particular practices. And in doing that, it meant that their implementation of these initiatives was done very thoughtfully and carefully. So before something was rolled out in the organisation, it was discussed, and there was an opportunity to kind of engage and give feedback on the idea and see whether it could be adapted in a certain way. So it was planned. There was planned activity that involved engaging with people. And there was also monitoring as well. So all of the initiatives were kind of reviewed on a regular basis to see whether they needed to be tweaked or carried on or stopped. So in summary, lessons from this case study were that the inner setting really reflected a culture and climate that valued the health and well-being of employees. And not just was this embedded in those mental health and wellbeing interventions themselves, but also in many of the other regular practices and procedures within the organisation. So it was really embedded throughout everything that they did. Individuals had key roles that were aligned, so there was a kind of shared view and value around mental health and well-being, and there were designated responsibilities, and those initiatives were implemented through very planned and deliberate, but also participative approaches, which meant that they could be tailored and people's feedback was taken into account, and there was ongoing monitoring to ensure that they remained effective. So this was just one of our 10 case studies, and over the next few months we're going to be completing the analysis for the rest of them. And what we'll be doing there is looking at the kind of the specifics within each case study, reflecting on those kind of context-specific elements of them, but then trying to draw some similarities across them to see where are the continuities, where are the consistent messages in relation to implementation that we can learn whatever the setting, and where are the context-specific elements. So thank you very much for your time. I think we're going to take questions at the end. Is that right? Yeah. We've got a bit of time. Okay. Well, I'm happy to take. If anyone's got any specific questions on this presentation, I'm happy to answer them now before I think I hand over to Juliet. Yes.
I have one question. So I'm Michael from a sports charity. We deal out like the workplace wellbeing initiatives with different corporates. Oh, sorry. A bit loud. Sorry, I'm Michael from Sports Charity. So we've been working with some sort of major corporates within the city, helping them implement some sort of employee wellbeing initiatives. And I'm just interested in some of the feedback we get. Is the initial cost for them to come out to do some of our programs or any things they're trying to implement? A lot of them are very much like, no, it would cost me too much money to leave those employees away for a day, and they don't really think about the other side of it. Is that researched much, or have you looked into that? The initial outlay of like taking time out of the day, like the hour of self-care, does that have an impact, or initially for a business, which is obviously a big barrier for a lot of businesses because you can only see that straight away. And seeing the productivity at the end is obviously harder for them to understand, I think. This is from my own experience.
Yeah, absolutely. I think particularly for smaller businesses, that is a big barrier, the cost element. And so in this particular example, these are all things that are actually low cost, kind of pretty much self-initiated. It was just about things that they did in their own, rather than kind of an initial outlay for those. I think I'm going to just look to Craig there, whether that's come up in any of them, but I would imagine it's the larger organisations who are probably more likely to have a budget which could be spent on whether it's mental health or maybe professional development or CSR type, so corporate social responsibility type activities, team building. I think sometimes if we just flag things as mental health and well-being relevant, we kind of miss some of the crossover actually, something like you're describing, it has a team building element, a physical health element, as well as a mental health element as well. But I think, for the smaller organisations, that's probably quite a big barrier.
Yeah. No, it's just interesting to hear your thoughts on it. But that was it. That's what our big sticking point is, really.
Yeah, I'm sure. Anything you want to add, Craig? Sorry, just wait for the mic.
Hi, just to say that in some of the other case studies that haven't properly been analysed yet, but basically some of the other case studies, that there were some, that I do recall some examples of where some interviews said, actually, we would like to have done this, but it was actually kind of, we were buying in external support and external help, and that was kind of a little bit of a barrier to us, but they sort of like looked at alternatives to that. So a lot of the stuff that's cropped up has been stuff that's been, that they haven't seen as particularly high cost, something they could do sort of internally themselves. So that is something that is coming through a little bit.
Do we have any questions online?
No. No, okay, well, we very happy. I think I'm on the panel later at the end, so if anyone thinks of any other questions relating to this one specifically, then please do ask them later on. But I'm going to hand over next to Juliet, who's going to continue with the next presentation. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. I feel like I'm really going to get my steps up today, doing the back and forth. So I'm glad I didn't wear high heels and went for some flats. I think this presentation builds really nicely on that presented from Louise before. What the heart of this bit of the project really is about trying to explore corporate climate around mental health and well-being. And we really wanted to try to better understand its link to employee health, certainly, but also trying to draw the link to productivity. So just to kind of give myself involved in it, but also Tashira and Craig at the back have been instrumental through this research, and Professor Holly Blake, who we'll see at the end. So let's maybe just start with situating ourselves in what do we think and define as corporate climate for mental health at work. So this is the shared beliefs that from workers that their psychological health and safety are protected and supported by senior management. So really at the heart of that definition is about a management value structure that underpins and influences the nature of the organization. And we know that there is growing evidence, primarily from Australia and various bits of Europe, that are showing us more a link between this kind of climate and mental health and well-being and its benefits for employees' health and well-being, so that's fantastic, but also that there seems to be benefits from the organization perspective in terms of productivity. We haven't seen as much research here in the UK or in the Republic of Ireland, so I wanted to give you a little bit of a flavor of some of the data that we have. So as a bit of a wider backdrop, what we aim to do is conduct a series of employee surveys across a variety of organizations. So we were lucky enough that we were able to recruit 35 organizations here in the UK, but also in the Republic of Ireland. And we asked them to disseminate well, I thought it was short, but it may be, as a researcher, maybe it wasn't as short as it should have been, a survey exploring a wide variety of things: climate, working conditions, employees' health and well-being, and employees' self-reported work performance and productivity. And what we wanted to do is for those that completed the survey was to follow them over time. And I suppose for us, the real benefit of us following them over time is not only did it give us a snapshot of what's happening now, but what we really wanted to understand was the things that you're reporting now, how much does that relate to or predict future events? So in this case, how much does corporate climate at time one, a really fantastic, wonderful climate in mental health and well-being, does that relate to, does that have a relationship with future productivity and work performance? So what did we find? Probably in many ways, we found kind of what we expected to find, which is kind of reassuring and good. So if we look at work performance, is there a direct link between corporate climate and mental health and well-being and employee self-reported performance, or later, about 9-10 months later? Yes. But what's really interesting is that we also see that that relationship is facilitated, not surprisingly, by psychological well-being and their self-reported work engagement. So not only is the corporate climate itself pretty important in terms of future work performance, but psychological well-being and motivation at work are really important ingredients that are also helping to facilitate that relationship. Then if we look at productivity, similar picture but slightly different, we don't see a direct link with climate and self-reported productivity. But really importantly, what we do see is this relationship is fully facilitated through employees' psychological well-being, mental health, and work engagement. So as a starting off platform, this became really interesting for us. It gave us some initial evidence to say, does corporate climate matter? Our evidence would suggest, yes, it's an important bit of this kind of wider puzzle around productivity and work performance. And does employee mental health and well-being, is that important in that? Yes, it seems to be a really important facilitator of that. So with that view, we kind of wanted to better understand, so what does that really mean? How do we begin to develop climates and organizations that are really centered on employee mental health and well-being? Dare I say, what's the secret sauce that's in the background? So as a starting off position, I think we reflected a lot on this idea of reflections on senior management values. And why do values matter? Suppose at an individual level, if we think about our values and our belief structure, they become really important in informing the decisions that we make and the behaviors that we make. So if I have a really strong belief structure around being healthy, being well, the chances probably are that, I try to go for walks as best I can, and I go to the gym when I can, and, maybe I take that self-care hour as a good example. Organizations, I think, are exactly the same. So if we think about the value structure that underpins an organization, it's going to be an important driving force between the decisions that are made at a strategic level in an organization, but also through the work behaviors that we see. So organizational values serve as a compass influencing decisions and shaping employee, and I'd say leaders' behaviors as well, ensuring alignment with the company's mission and goals. So taking that view, what we did within that survey is we tried to identify a case study collection. In particular, we wanted to identify organizations that were getting it spot on. And what was really useful for us is using the survey, we were able to find benchmark standards that allowed us to say, those organizations have a fantastic corporate climate and mental health and well-being, as viewed by people working in that organization. Those organizations are doing something right, but it's kind of in the middle territory. And some organizations where you go, oh dear. So we were really fortunate in that we have 17 of those organizations, so 17 of those 35 were absolutely getting it right and had a really high climate in psychological health and well-being. So we did a series of interviews with those organizations. We talked to their senior leaders, we talked to their managers, we talked to their employees, because we wanted to understand what was behind this kind of climate. How did they get there? What was, quote, the secret sauce? And what we found as we went through these interviews is that there was these 7 key business values that kept emerging, kept underpinning and influencing what they did, why they did it, and why it was fundamentally important to the nature of that organization. So we have referred to this as the support business values framework. So I'll go through each one of these values one by one. But in particular, what we found really remarkable is each one of these business values had a really important role to play in these organizations, in the policies that they made and implemented, in the procedures and how those unfolded, but also in terms of the practices and behaviors within the workplace. I guess I'm going to stop there in a moment and just say that this is a building model where we're still trying to collect information and feedback on it. So this is a really wonderful opportunity for me to see what you think and to get your thoughts and reflections from your own organization, your own professional practice. I hope that there's things and reflections in there for us as leaders and managers in our own right, but also really interesting to get your reflections on how these values, these corporate values, may interrelate in the more system-level nature of organizations. So let's start with the first one, which is safety. So in the blue box, I've given you what we've got as our working definition for this value. So to foster a psychologically safe environment where mistakes are learning opportunities and to cultivate a supportive culture. So what might that look like in practice? So it may be examples that may be about fostering open communication. So to encourage a culture where employees feel safe to share ideas, concerns, and learn from mistakes. To promote continuous learning. So to view mistakes as growth opportunities and to support employees with constructive feedback. And in the bottom there, I've just put an example that we had extrapolated from our own interviews. So these are coming from the interviews themselves when talking about it with individuals. So an example here is a leader highlights successes and setbacks in team meetings where they're really shared as learning opportunities. Understanding. So here we're defining this work characteristic as prioritizing mental health through empathetic leadership, supportive management, and employee-focused policies. So some examples of that in practice may include leading with understanding and compassion, showing genuine care for employees' mental well-being. Wonderful examples of that, really emulated a lot through the interviews, through employees really talking about the importance of being able to talk with their leaders, to talk with their managers, but feeling safe to do so, feeling that they would be heard and understood. So we also might think about training managers to actively support mental health by recognizing challenges and offering appropriate assistance, and thinking about then the context of employee-focused policies. So developing and implementing policies that prioritize mental health, ensuring that they are responsive to employees' needs, and to promote a healthy work-life balance. And actually, I'm just reflecting on that last one from the last presentation in terms of that self-care hour. I mean, it might be an interesting example of, that sort of core value in terms of giving people the time and the space and valuing that at a really kind of core organizational level in terms of people prioritizing their health, their well-being, their mental health, et cetera. So people-focused, so fostering meaningful workplace relationships to ensure employees feel included, supported, and valued. So some examples of that might include building a workplace where everyone feels included, heard, recognized, and valued. Strengthening relationships, so promoting collaboration and recognizing contributions to enhance trust and camaraderie. What was really interesting, and I think something that emerged time and time again within the organizations, was this importance of relationships. And maybe if we contextualize that to coming out of the COVID period, where so many of us, in terms of our work relationships, all of that was digitally, facilitated. And I know from a very personal perspective, what did I miss? I missed the running into somebody in the corner and going, oh, how are you doing? Or in the kitchen, making a cup of coffee, and just having those little moments where you're building an important and meaningful relationship at work. And that might not be about anything to do with work at all, but just having a meaningful connection. A lot of the participants almost conceptualize this as almost family values, really thinking about this as the collective and supporting each other. So some examples that we saw were leaders encouraging idea sharing in team meetings, ensuring everybody contributes, and this idea of really important people feeling heard. So not just soliciting feedback for the sake of soliciting feedback, but really meaningfully listening to that and responding to that in a meaningful way. Protecting and promoting employee health. So adopting comprehensive employee health strategies that go beyond legal compliance by supporting mental health through workplace adaptations, promoting resilience, proactively managing job demands, and enhancing job resources. So really thinking about this rather than one-off events. In these organizations, what we can see is an importance in terms of seeing these holistically, comprehensively, dare I say complementary, so that all of these aspects of how an organization supports an individual to thinking all the way in terms of how do we create good quality jobs, great working conditions, all of that was seen as important and instrumental. So going beyond just minimum standards or one-off events, dare I say the Wellness Wednesday or the fruit on a Thursday, but thinking about this as really integral to the nature of the organization and how it operates and why it operates. Openness, encouraging open, supportive, continuous dialogue to ensure management is engaged and accessible. And this was something that was really important, and we heard sort of time and time again about the importance of management and leaders being accessible to those within the workplace for conversations, for reflections, whether or not that's about having meaningful conversations about mental health at work, or maybe that's just about getting some feedback or thoughts on career development or a project that's ongoing. So ensuring that those are open and regular communications between employees and management, and making sure that leadership is approachable and responsive, fostering mutual respect and engagement. So interesting examples coming out in terms of the importance of open door policies. I think one participant talked about traveling to meetings with their manager, and that they thought that was such a great opportunity for them to have a chat about what was going on, whether that was about stuff that was happening at home or concerns they had at work or challenges that they had, but just having a space that was accessible, free, and non-judgmental to just talk about where they were at, where they're going, and maybe what they needed in order to be supported at work. Rest and recovery. So encouraging, and employees are encouraged to maintain and support a healthy work-life balance, to rest and recover during non-working hours. So this may be about us thinking about flexible policies at work, thinking about how we discuss and emphasize boundaries at work. That may be particularly challenging for organizations that have remote working practices. We know in the COVID period that became really difficult to establish what's work and what's my personal sort of time. So how are we thinking about that as an organization and as a senior leadership team in terms of ensuring we're communicating the value, the importance of taking time off on the weekend or in the evenings, going for that sunny beach holiday, which we're all thinking about now as it's getting gray and cold. So how are we encouraging that? How are we embedding that within the fabric of the organization? And lots of really interesting examples of the importance of leaders demonstrating this through their own behaviors. So that may be something as, seeing leaders prioritize taking time off with the family, or going on that sunny break, et cetera. So thinking about how we really encourage and support those to ensure they're taking the rest and recovery from work. And finally, trust and transparency. So ensure fairness and integrity in all processes by fostering transparent communication, equitable resource distribution, underpinned by consistent and supportive management practices. So really at the heart of the thinking about the importance of trust, maintaining trust, protecting trust, transparency in what we do and how we do it and why we make those decisions. And really thinking about and emphasizing and putting at the core fairness, whether that's through the distribution of resources or upholding consistent management practices. So as a sort of a framework of 7 core values, we can sort of start to see how as an organization can think about the application of these in very micro ways in terms of just one-to-one communications between colleagues at work. It may be at more meso ways in terms of thinking about how we support teams, cultivate team building, and how do we emphasize and encourage these wide variety of values. But I also think there's value in terms of thinking at this at really strategic levels when we think about policies and procedures and how we ensure we're putting these as a core value structure at the heart of what we do and why we do it. So I think if we look across the core values, if you will, what's like the umbrella take-home message? And I think really what we hope from this framework, what we learn from this best practice case study, is across all interactions and processes, the aim is to maintain a supportive and understanding approach to reinforce trust, collaboration, and value. And I would argue not only is that important from a mental health perspective, but actually if we start to think about that from a performance development and enhancement perspective, all of those are key and important messages. So not only can we see that this is beneficial from employee mental health and well-being, but can become a very useful framework for us to sort of think about that in terms of performance and productivity enhancement and development. And with that, thank you for listening. I'm just going to do a time check to see. Sorry. Oh, I still have a little bit of time. If there's any questions, I'm happy to take 1 or 2 now, or we'll hand over to a wider discussion. Guess we'll hand over to a wider discussion. It got me out of the hot seat, so that's okay. So it's my absolute pleasure to introduce two of our panel members. Dr. Kara McGann is Head of Skills and Social Policy at IBEC and has a wealth of experience, both from that policy perspective but an industry perspective. And Nola Carroll, who is the Organizational Health Lead for the Health and Safety Executive National HR Division. So if I could welcome you both up to the stage. Oh. And I'm also going to welcome up my colleague, Dr. Louise Thompson, and hand over to yourselves and to our virtual delegates in terms of burning questions, reflections, not just on what we've talked about within these presentations, but I think there's so many wider questions about the importance of mental health at work, how we engage organizations in the discussion, in the dialogue, in those practices. How do we think about and operationalize that, maybe from a policy perspective? So I'll sort of hand over to yourselves. Actually, if there's any reflections from the panel as people gather their thoughts on any kind of burning questions, if that's okay, if there's any thoughts or reflections on what we've talked about, maybe what we haven't talked about, or that you think is something that needs to be at the forefront of the discussion when we talk about and think about mental health and productivity.
I might start.
Thank you.
Thanks very much both for the invitation today and also for the really, really interesting presentations. I think what's superb about the work is how accessible it is. It's oftentimes talking about things that employers are doing, but also maybe things that they haven't considered doing, but putting it in a very accessible framework, and both with the case studies and indeed the support framework, I think giving employers food for thought and a way of maybe operationalizing maybe some of the things that they might be doing, maybe not consistently, but in a way that can actually put a wrap around what they're actually trying to do. So I think it's a really exciting framework, and it's one I certainly will be talking about a lot.
No, brilliant. Not sure. Oh, it is working. I'm just speaking really slowly. Fantastic. Thank you. Any other sort of?
Yeah.
Oh, brilliant. Yes, please.
Yeah. Just to clarify, Juliet, I'm Health Service Executive, in case I'm not a Health and Safety Executive, the Health and Social Care sector in the Republic of Ireland. So if you look at it from an employer perspective, and thoughts come to my head when you were talking, Juliet and Louise, in your presentations, thank you very much. What do you expect, or what is it you're seeking for in your employees? So quite often we employ people for a role in a job, and then you fulfill that by payment. But it's more than that. If you're looking at your employees, and if you look at even your competitors, what's the difference? Quite often we have the same equipment, we have the same buildings, we have the same systems. What's different is the people. So people who are in my workplace may not be present, are not going to be present in another workplace. So what do you expect of that employee? Well, you want them to show up for work, to be able to work, to be able to contribute to that work. And irrelevant even to the point of how meaningful that work might be, even if it's something that they're doing repetitive on a daily basis, or something where maybe they're in the background in a management role, at any given day they're going to find themselves in a situation where they have to resolve a problem, or there's a complex situation that they find themselves in, or that they need to be quick thinking, or they need to have flexible thinking. So they need to be in a cognitive state of wellness. Their brains need to be functioning really well for that day. And the world that we live in at the moment, and living and working in 2024, is so fast-paced. There's so much pressures on people at work, outside of work. So when people are working in that workplace, you want them to be feeling, in a way, going back to Juliet's about flourishing, that they are able to contribute to that work on that day as best as they can. And that's why mental health and managing that mental health piece and managing stressors, etc., is so important, because we know that mental health, from all the research, will impact not just on our physical and our psychological, emotional well-being, but also impacts on our cognitive functionings. And people who are experiencing a lot of stress and stress responses on a daily basis are also experiencing challenges with their cognitive functions around thinking. So if you have a workforce that are experiencing a lot of concerns with their mental health, are stressed, that workforce isn't going to be at their best on that day in that job. Now, there can be multiple reasons for that, even just tiredness of maybe have not slept very well, or a new baby in a house, or whatever else is going on. And so going back to your question that was raised earlier about investing in mental health, you had asked it yourself there. You want your employees to be functioning at their best. So, and you want them also to be trusting and to be loyal to the work that you're doing, to get behind the wheel, the shoulder to the wheel, that sort of phrase, when there are tough times. So investing in well-being and mental health isn't just about ticking the box. It's also about supporting your employees, that you know on that day your employees are at their best as they can be, because you've given them whatever the supports, the tools, the culture, whatever it is that they require to be able to perform. And that was just a thought I had, Juliet, when you were speaking there around mental well-being and shifting it from the cost of it when it goes wrong, but actually investing more to keep it right and to invest more in our people, because we want them to be able to show up at work and flourish at work and be the best they can be. And also, if we are spending up on 40 years or more, with generations coming up who may be working for up on 50 years, it's not that we just kind of go through that lives and those years of our lives just as a matter of functioning because we get paid for it. We want to know actually that it's worthwhile, and we have a younger generation who are very much value based around that it has to be meaningful. So you're ticking multiple boxes in terms of investing in mental health and well-being in the workplace, and that were just the thoughts I had, Juliet.
Brilliant. Thanks. Louise, if you've got any reflections building on that?
I think I completely agree, and I think thinking about the next generation, I think, is a really important in relation to this agenda. And what motivates them, as you say, it's not just that extrinsic, but much more intrinsically motivated. And I think how they respond to those initiatives and what they look for in an employer is really, is really important to consider as well. One of my reflections was just around the importance of culture and values, which I think is really highlighted, not only from the work that Craig and I've been doing, but in your support framework that you've just presented. And I think one of the big challenges is that isn't a quick fix. And culture takes time to change or to kind of embed. So just to kind of flip it on its head, to think about, actually how do we go as businesses, as managers, how do we go about, trying to put in place and embed those values and display those behaviours and ensure that there's a consistency in those is I guess, a question maybe to the audience. So that was one of my reflections.
Could I just add, Juliet, because it's a really interesting point that you both make with regards to particularly the younger generation coming up, because what we're seeing a lot is, in addition to that particular desire for purpose when they're making decisions about their organisations, and the desire to understand, what are you doing around diversity and inclusion, mental health and well-being, sustainability, and many other areas. But oftentimes the same generation are ones that are also a little bit different to maybe some of us that have come before, because they've actually been through something very, very different. And I think the pandemic has left a lot of scars on that generation that's coming into the workplace, that they have missed out on opportunities and also come out. And some of the research we're seeing is certainly issues around greater heightened levels of anxiety, of different attitudes to how they engage, and concerns. And so, as important as mental health and well-being is for everybody, I think there's an additional responsibility on us for that generation coming through, and how we adapt and how we engage with them to make sure that they are supported and able to flourish within the workplace. That might be a little bit different to maybe some of the other generations in our workplace at the same time. So I think it's a really good point.
And it's an interesting challenge, isn't it, in terms of thinking about that from a very strong adaptability perspective, in terms of, what is it that we need to think about today, but also recognizing that that landscape probably will look different in 5-10 years from now, as the nature of the workplace changes, as the demographics within the workplace change, but also just reflecting on that really significant event in terms of the pandemic and its implications for the kind of, as you said, sort of generations below, and what will that look like, and how do we support and facilitate that? I don't know if there's any questions within the room, or indeed, dare I say, the virtual room. Oh, yes.
So building on what you all were just talking about, how do you think that workplace policies and practices can cater to the mental health and well-being needs of different generations, considering that sometimes they may conflict with one another? Older persons may prioritize different things than younger persons do. And it may not be a question that can be easily answered, but if you have any thoughts on that, I think that would be interesting to know.
Yeah. In workplaces, what I would see is that people have the same goal, so irrelevant of your generation and the age or where you are in position in terms of that workplace, the goal is to be wherever it is you need to be. How you get there may be quite different across different generations in terms of working up. So I do think what I'm delighted to see with the programme here, when in one of them is that value pieces that Juliet was talking about, and the consultation and openness and the conversations. What I often find is it's having the conversation is usually the biggest obstacle. And when they get to that stage of actually just opening up that conversation, even if you have a small workplace with different people of different age groups and different generations, and exploring that, how do we get there? Yet every one of you might have a different vision or a different view of how you do that. But it's about opening up that conversation. And I would always see that's the biggest challenge quite often, is to move into that space. For an employer or for a manager to have the confidence to move into that space, to have that conversation. And also, quite often, it's not for the employer or the manager to have the answers. Those that are on the ground doing that work, or those, even if they're different generations, they see it from, yes, their perspective and from their window, but maybe not from a person of a different age. But they all can collectively contribute to that conversation. And with contributing to the conversation, they all can collectively come up with solutions or come up with ideas. And really, the manager or the employer's role in that situation is just facilitating that, and then getting behind it with that leadership support to then actually bring that out, those ideas, and work on them and bring them in with a specific timeline, testing them, see how it goes, evaluating them. So sometimes an employer might think they need to move into that space and have the answers. They don't. They just need to facilitate the conversation and then facilitate the outcomes and allow that particular workforce then move into that space themselves with their own actions.
I think you're absolutely right. Different strokes for different folks is very true here, and that applies across the generations and ages and all forms of diversity. And I suppose that's why I think wellness action plans can be a really good initiative, actually, because they are, a standard document that allows people to reflect their individual needs and preferences and challenges. So it really, that's a kind of good intervention in a way that acknowledges that difference and enables that flexibility and enables those differences and preferences to be kind of acknowledged and worked into the plan. So I think that kind of ability to tailor is important, and just to acknowledge also that there's not going to be one thing that works for everybody, and you're going to need that kind of tailored and a menu of different approaches that different types of individuals with different needs can choose the right thing from them.
I think it's a great question, and for me there's probably a couple of pieces to it. I mean, first of all, I think you're absolutely right that that the multi-generational piece, we have 5 generations in the workplace, probably for the first time ever, and there is no one-size-fits-all when it comes to mental health and well-being, I think, for sure. And to Nullig's point, I think that means those conversations are really, really important. However, sometimes what we hear from employers is that the manager in particular, who is oftentimes the first to see, maybe, concerns from an individual, or indeed to be the first person approached when somebody's having some concerns, or indeed from a preventative perspective, can be quite fearful about what does this actually involve and what are you asking me to do, and sometimes that can result in not having the conversation at all because it's safer, because I'm afraid of what you might be looking for and I might not have the capacity to deliver on that. But I do think having those open conversations is hugely, hugely important. I do think also there is a piece which says, again, to Nolik's point, it's not about necessarily the manager having all of the answers, but I would say actually some of the times it's not even the organisation having all of the answers, but possibly helping to signpost to where those answers might be. So sometimes it can be a case of, equipping people with the skills to mind their own mental health and to support them in that process. Or if things are going wrong and you've worked on making sure that the workplace is as supportive as it can be and things still go wrong, being there to again signpost to where those other additional supports might be. But I think having those kind of very honest and clear conversations, both with managers as well as the broader employer body, can really help with that. The expectation sometimes on managers to feel like they have to solve these problems and therefore taking it on themselves can additionally impact their own mental health. But actually having that understanding that, look, nobody's expecting you to be the expert in this area. However, what we are expecting you to do is have those open and kind of comfortable conversations and being able to talk about mental health in a very open and stigma-free way. That means that everybody feels, okay, this is a safe environment. I feel that this is a culture I could actually disclose in if I'm having a challenge, and indeed I know where to look for support. So I think it's probably that kind of approach maybe is what's going to work for us best.
Brilliant. I can see that there is a variety of questions coming from our virtual attendees, so I might just sort of hand over to Craig if you want to.
Yeah, we've got a comment and a few questions also coming through. First of all, a comment from Anne Parsons, who says that the role of leadership will require some, if not many, learning and change. And it will be necessary to consider ways the business can continue to be productive and profitable. Perhaps the framework may support retention through job satisfaction. And then there's a couple more questions coming. Firstly, from Craig Stewart, who asks, is there anything from the research or panel members' experience that indicates what facilities or services employees value from a physical workplace point of view to make the days in the workplace more supportive, enjoyable and productive? So that's one question. Shall we...
I think we'll, any reflections on that question in terms of distilling that question in terms of thinking about the resources within the workplace and sounds like possibly thinking about that in the context of the physical work environment, but also maybe wider sort of resources and services that may be particularly advantageous or valued by employees.
So certainly, in terms of the physical work environment, I think it very much depends on the context and the kind of sector. So there is such a kind of variation. But if we think about what are often the traditional desk-based, office-based environments, I think there's a growing body of evidence about getting away from your desk, getting some exercise, some taking breaks. To provide that, getting away from that kind of sitting position, getting some fresh air, getting some exercise, and uptaking things like walking meetings, outdoor meetings and those kind of things, just to kind of break up the day, but incorporate some kind of physical well-being and exercise. But it is very context-specific, I think, and sector-specific. But there is a growing body of evidence to look at the benefits of that kind of outdoor element to your kind of day.
I think we've also seen a lot of companies kind of building on that as well. They've mapped out on their campus kind of 5K walks, 2K walks and so on, so that if people are interested in doing something on a break or taking a break after something, they can see what's happening. Similarly, we're seeing a lot of step challenges and stuff to kind of promote that kind of activity, and also the concept that we expect that you will want to have this as well within your working day, and that's perfectly acceptable. But I think for me, a lot of the areas that we are looking at are less about the physical and more about the kind of back to your climate and culture sort of approach, in terms of that it's okay to ask for flexibility or doing things different. And actually we should be considering that, you know, because we've always done it this way doesn't mean that's the only way to do it. And actually there's nothing wrong with doing it differently. And I think if the pandemic gave us anything, it's you know, the kind of the opportunity that we had to test doing things differently and still being productive. And actually that definitely for most of our employers, certainly we're hearing from them, that certainly was their experience in the main. So now how do we bring it back and take the good stuff and leave the bad stuff, and not have it that people are working to burn out, or that they're not seeing a cut-off between the work and the personal, as was noted within the research as well. So I think certainly that openness to maybe doing it differently, and actually how do we get the best out of it without, you know, going to any extremes.
It's interesting, I was just reflecting on that point, and one from earlier, which is, you know, that importance and that value of adaptability and changeability. And I think it's interesting, probably COVID, I think, it brought us many things, but it also did highlight that, you know, we can adapt, we can change, we can do things differently. But I think there's also inherently a certain level of that we're uncomfortable with that as sort of humans. And I wonder whether that's also true in terms of organizations, because we're leaning slightly into the unknown. And I think that sometimes can be quite challenging. Useful, but inherently probably comes with a certain amount of challenges to that. I know we've got more questions online, so maybe we'll take another one online, unless there's any in... Oh, yeah.
Thanks, Julia. Hello, my name's Colin Robinson. I work for ESRC, the drugs and alcohol charity. I was just wondering about the whole thing around presenteeism. I realised it was a serious issue. I didn't realise the actual statistical scale was as frightening as it is. And I'm just wondering how that's been influenced maybe by, you know, during COVID and post-COVID, the move to working at home. And people, I mean, we work a hybrid system in our place, and that works fine most of the time, but I'm wondering, you know, how often people are maybe tempted to think, well, I'm not well enough to go into the office to work, but sure, I can work from home, I can do my job online, and how much that's contributing to it, and, you know, how you can kind of try and offset the effects of that if it is a thing.
I think you're definitely right that it's much easier to engage in presenteeism, which is, you know, working when unwell, when we can facilitate that home-based working. I think that's absolutely, you know, you hit the nail on the head there. And I suppose it's about encouraging our employees, you know, to take that time off when they need to enable a faster recovery. Actually, if they, you know, if they have an illness, you know, take the time off and enable that full recovery.
Yeah, so the hybrid, what we would have seen in our organisation was what COVID did was accelerated that. You know, it was already changing to that opportunity to have a hybrid work, or work remotely, or work from home. There's a couple of different, what I'm seeing is that there's that trust piece as well, you know, working hybrid and working from home. And it's less about the hours of input and more around task focused. So for example, if there's 3 pieces of work to be delivered by Friday, that's delivered, rather than looking at it sitting for how many hours a day in front of a laptop. So there's ways around that. But you have to be flexible in your thinking around that, and flexible, and you know, the team also has to be able to adapt to that. So rather than looking at it just hours worked, but actually what was asked was delivered. The other side to it, what I come across quite often, is that virtual platform, and that is where the challenge is in terms of building mental health wellbeing supports and having that safe psychosocial work environment across a virtual platform. I always would say, and I believe, well-being is built into the everyday of how we work, rather than it also being an add-on. It's how we work. So when you look at how you work, a team that is working across a virtual platform with back-to-back meetings all day, you'd have to ask the question, where is the actual work getting done? Quite often people also, because they have a level of expertise, can be invited into meetings online, and they can spend all day participating in other people's work, where they're contributing as an advisor and expertise, and not actually getting any of their own work done. And so there has to be more open up conversations around that, how we actually work within that virtual space. So, you know, what is effective, what's efficient, what's of our time and of our resources and using them. What I've also seen in areas is the creeping in of organising team meetings on lunch hours. You know, so where I've worked with teams where they've actually gone back to looking at the values piece and realising, well, actually, this is protected space. So no more organising, you know, teams call at 1:30 or at 1:10 or whatever. So we tended to move into that space quite rapidly with very little planning and thinking ahead as to how that would work in practice. There's time now and opportunity to pull back on that and see what is working and what's efficient, effective, and how best that fits for the employer, for the work that needs to be done, but also the mental well-being and the engagement of staff.
I'd have to echo that 100% because I think, as you say, we moved into it so quickly and maybe without any warning. And we did make adjustments. You know, you'd see at the banner or at the end of people's emails, you know, this email was sent at a time that suits me. You don't really have to reply except, you know, that kind of thing. So we did put some things in place. But I don't think that we've actually got our head around how we manage in this different way. And that's leading to some of those pitfalls along the way. So I think we do have that opportunity, as Nolik says, to now kind of regroup, because I think hybrid is bringing a lot of benefits for a lot of people around the mental health and wellbeing space. For one, you know, not having to maybe commute as often, not having your workplace set up that's good for your mental health in a different way maybe than it would be in a workplace environment per se. But I don't know that we've fully got our heads around how to manage in this different way that allows us to ensure that people are flourishing and getting the best out of people without falling into some of those traps along the way.
I was just reflecting on and building on, I think, all those wonderful comments. I remember somebody saying to me, this was about a while ago, you know, if I'm not physically well, I've got a cold, I've got a flu, I've hurt my back, I don't feel the same love of phoning into my employer saying, you know what, I need a day off. You know, I'm full of colds or whatever the case may be. It's interesting, I think, when we shift that paradigm to talking about mental health, how many of us maybe feel comfortable saying, do you know what, today, from a mental health perspective, I'm not feeling well. And so I need to take the day off and rest, recover, watch too much Netflix, go for a walk, whatever the case may be. And I wonder whether or not some of the discourse and dialogue is also about a paradigm shift to sort of making it permissible, valued, viewed as important to say, actually taking a day off because you've got a cold and a flu is equally as valid as taking a day off because, you know, I'm feeling overwhelmed, stressed, anxious, whatever the case may be, and whether we need to sort of look at how we open that up from an employee perspective, but also maybe from an organizational perspective as well. I know we've got some more online, so maybe we'll go back to another question online.
We have a question from Peter Mulvihill. Is there anything in the research that quantifies employee participation in workplace wellbeing initiatives?
Juliet? Have we used any of those measures in any of our... I'm just trying to think.
Not in either of the work packages. No. But I guess from my own perspective, I mean, there's so much research that really highlights the importance of that participatory orientated approach. I mean, whether you look at that from an ergonomics perspective or even from a workplace health. So I think in a sense, maybe the link back to the present, sorry, I'm not on the panel, I probably shouldn't be, apologies. But you know, in terms of, I think, including people to make sure they feel heard, they feel recognized, and that we're making workplaces that are fit for purpose and meet the needs of those employees. I think, from my perspective, the only way we can meaningfully do that is from a participatory orientated approach. So including people in building a shared value, but also a shared workplace that has been kind of co-created and co-designed actively and continuously.
Yeah, and there are some really good papers, I'm going to try and remember, that are good examples of this. Particularly, there's some by occupational health psychologists in Norway that look at participatory organisational interventions. There's one called the Sigtuna Principles, S-I-G-T-U-N-A. I can't remember the first author, Von Thiel, I think, the Sigtuna principles that it might be worth taking a look at if you're interested in it. But it's very much about how do you embed participation and engagement in the design of your workplace health initiatives. So I'd recommend that one. Maybe we can dig it out and drop it in the chat after the session or share it, but I think that's some good examples.
Brilliant. Any other kind of questions in the room? Do you have any other questions? Oh, okay. I guess, could I ask a question, if that's okay? I have the mic, so no one's going to stop me, are they really? For me, I think one of the things that I keep reflecting a lot about is it feels as though to shift the discussion and dialogue about mental health and opening that up to not just talking about ill health, but talking about wellness in its broadest sense, it feels like there needs to be a paradigm shift. That it's sort of looking at the workplace in a new and innovative way to say that it's not just where we do work, but actually it's an environment that can have all sorts of other benefits. And I guess my question is, how do we do that? How do we start the dialogue and open that up to sort of see how and where we might be able to change perceptions or practices, whether that be within organizations, maybe, or even at the policy level, if you think that's relevant or valuable?
I'm happy to just chip in with a few thoughts around that, which is I think that the nature of work is going to change so dramatically over the coming 10, 20, 30 years that actually it's a dialogue about how do we build the future of work to ensure that work becomes a central part of our well-being as part of our lives. Because I think, with the huge advances in relation to AI, they are going to start impacting on what we do, and actually this could potentially give us an opportunity to focus on the innovative, creative, interesting, positive aspects of work and actually use AI to help us get rid of some of the stressful, boring, dull elements of our work and do more different things. So I think it's also a broader conversation about what the future of work looks like and how we can design work to maximize our well-being whilst using the tools that enable us to maybe get rid of some of the heavy lifting in a metaphorical sense. I don't have to do any heavy lifting in my job, thank you, in a physical sense.
To add to that then as well, it was just, as we were talking here, quite a lot of people enjoy their work, so there is that other side to it, that being in employment and being part of a team and enjoying successful career and a skill that you've developed, a lot of people actually do enjoy that, and quite often they want to stay in the work, but it's sometimes other factors outside of their control that often then, where they get to the point of maybe where they have no option or they're heading for burnout and they want to leave. So I think we need to pull back a bit and actually look at that side of it, actually, that the workplace can be actually a really great place for people to interact with each other, to build their skills, evolve as a person, enjoy it, bring a little bit of fun back into it, instead of it seen to be kind of that it should be the hard place. Actually, it's a good place. And for some people, it's actually their sanctuary. Life is tough. And so sometimes going into work and sharing that space with a group of people who may become your friends over the years is actually a nice place to be. So I think we need to also, in that thought, Juliet, you're talking about, is actually shifted from it being a hard place and a hard space to actually this is a really enjoyable place to be, and what we can do when we put our heads together and what we can create and what we can deliver. I think that's an important part of it as well.
I think at the policy level as well, some of those conversations have started already, and particularly to the point about the future of work. we're hearing a lot of conversations around the just transition, and that's not just with regards to AI and digital, but also climate change and moving the types of work that we do, or the types of industries that we have, and how that's going to impact on employees and future employees and the types of jobs that we might do. But it gives us a lot of opportunities, I think, to shape that moving forward, and opportunities to have different types of possibly jobs with different meaning, because maybe some of that boring, repetitive stuff has been taken away by AI, or is somewhat obsolete. But I think at the same time, we've got to co-create that. It's got to be something that we're considering in the round, as opposed to a diktat from the top. It's certainly got to be something that's looked at from all angles. And certainly, as I say, the policy conversations that we're hearing at the moment do seem to be taking that on board, even at the level of labour market activation, and looking at, we're in the Republic of Ireland, we're at a 4.3% unemployment rate at the moment, but not everybody is experiencing that level of full employment in the same way, and there's a lot of marginalised groups that would love to be in employment that just cannot seem to access employment. And to Nullig's point, the purpose that comes with having employment, and the camaraderie and all the other positive psychosocial impacts that come with having a job and having good quality employment are not to be underestimated. So I think going forward, there's a lot of things for us to think about, but I do think that conversation is starting already, and hopefully will build.
Yeah, and to add to that, I think it's a multiple level approach that's required. From employer representatives to employee representative groups, to even at government level as well as organisational level, that will enable then the smaller business and the smaller workplace, or even the smaller employer, to say that this is okay to actually move into this space and have a clear roadmap of how I do that. In the Republic of Ireland, the Department of Health launched in 2021 Healthy Workplace Framework Initiative, and they've just put out a communication where they're looking for between 30 and 40 workplaces across the Republic of Ireland to come forward and participate over the next 18 months on a Healthy Workplace programme. So we're definitely seeing some really positive investment into this space. And what I would say at an SME level, it's keeping an eye out also on what's happening in that space and tapping into that and those resources. And then when you're looking at it back in your own work site, is being very clear on what your roadmap is, having your policy, looking at what training you might need, or tapping into that training, tapping into resources in your local community. So it's a holistic view at a multiple level that will enable everyone at that local level and have that conversation. The other then is the thought process of coming forward and saying, I'm not having a good day. Is that an indicator that I'm not good at the job? And I think that's the bit that's there and has been there that we need to also shift, that coming forward and asking for help is not a sign of weakness, a sign of strength. And just because you may be finding it a tough time at work is nothing got to do whether you're a successful employee or you're good at your job. All of us are only human, there has to be that humanity piece, that we can at any time be really successful and working with it, but at any moment that can shift and change for us. And I think the leadership and managers, employers have a really important role around that as well, around their understanding of what leadership is and how to support people and change that rhetoric that's there, that coming forward and talking about mental health is that you're not able for the job or that there's weakness. Actually, you're the person that I need to support the most, because I need you and I need your skills and I want you and I enjoy working with you. We want you to stay.
I might just ask one quick sort of follow-up kind of question from that really interesting discussion, and then I'll sort of hand over to Professor Holly Blake, who's going to very kindly kind of summarize some of the key takeaways. But one of the things that I think I've been professionally reflecting a lot on, and just reflecting through that discussion, is the pace of change. Like, if I think about AI, I mean, it's this pace of it has been absolutely incredible. And so I was just reflecting on those thoughts and views in terms of the future of work. Where do we go? How do we co-create it together? And reflecting on how challenging that might be, given how quickly some of these changes are occurring and embedding within the nature of work now. And if you've got any reflections on how do we tackle that pace of change? You know, how do we embrace it, or is it about managing it, or maybe it's not really that big of an issue? But I guess just for me personally, I've just been reflecting so much on how quickly things are adapting and changing.
I think definitely that's the reality out there, and I think it can be a little bit unsettling for people, because in the past maybe the leaders or the managers in an organisation were a number of steps ahead, but actually they're going through the same changes and challenges with us, which can be a little bit disconcerting, because sometimes they're only a page ahead in terms of where we're going in direction. And that's changing, and they're changing as well, which is really important. But I think the resilience piece of work, and the work that we're doing around mental health and resilience, because given that the only change we know, or the only constant that we know, is that change, and the speed is just ramping up and ramping up. You know, I think some people talk about how we survived the pandemic as opposed to we thrived during it. And I think people have different experiences within that. But I think it put us on a kind of a bit of a roller coaster in terms of the pace just picking up. So I do think it's something that we really need to, if anything, double down on the mental health and wellbeing work that's ongoing. So the packages of work that have been done here, the research that's been done here, and building on that and disseminating it further, so that that kind of really embeds into our organisational structures and our policy making around the need for that. Because back to, I think, something Nullik said was, if we don't have people who are, you know, feeling mentally strong or supported to come back to being mentally strong, they're not contributing. They're not contributing for themselves. They're not flourishing for themselves, for their organisation, and the broader Ireland Inc. So I think that it's never been more important, and it's that pace really is putting it up to us.
So to carry on from that, to be able to respond to that pace, you know, you need to have an engaged workforce. You know, you need people to be resilient. The psychosocial safety climate, which is a construct that was developed in Australia, all of the evidence and research they've been doing in the last 15 years using that particular construct is that having that psychosocial safety climate at work, that value piece, does determine outcomes for not just well-being, for engagement behaviours and innovative behaviours. So again, it's tying it back up to that it's not just the nice thing to do, it actually is the right thing to do.
Well, I would just say that, yeah, I think the thing with the AI and the pace of change is it's not going to settle, is it? It's yeah, like you said, that is the constant. So we have to just become adaptable and creative and open to those new ways of working. And it brings us really back to that whole kind of new generation of workers, because I think they will be embracing it and using it much more than I am able to. Yeah. So I need to be open to thinking about ways that I can change the way I work to embrace those. So yeah, change is the only constant.
Brilliant. Well, I hope you'll join me in thanking our panel members for their reflections and their contributions. With that, I'm going to sort of welcome virtually, amazing technology, a colleague who's been instrumental within this program, but she's kindly been listening in the background and is going to sort of summarize key reflections, hopefully some key take-home messages. So I'll hopefully virtually hand over. There we go.
It's absolutely fantastic to see so many people here today that have a vested interest in work and health. Thank you all for listening to these presentations that showcase some of the work that we've been doing in this field, and for actively engaging in the Q&A discussions. Some really useful thoughts there from the panel. One of the key factors we're aware of is that research is really important, but of most relevance to all of us is how research findings can translate through into policy and practice so that they can make a difference in real-world context, and that's why we're all here today. Just to recap on what we've heard in this event, the event was opened by Professor Simon Teasdale, the Director of Research at Queen's Business School, who kindly supported us in hosting this event on site. And we've then heard from Stephen Roper, who's Professor of Enterprise at Warwick Business School and Director of the Enterprise Research Studies, the overall programme lead for this series of studies and has brought us all together as a multidisciplinary team. So just thinking back on our presentations today, Juliet has presented to you the business case for mental health and wellbeing at work. And she's provided facts and figures on the rising prevalence and high cost of mental health at work, including absenteeism and including presenteeism, which we know occurs significantly higher cost to organisations than absence. And this really highlights the urgency with which organisations need to take steps to address these rising costs and challenges. But a key message from this presentation is that we need to consider not only the productivity losses of ill health at work, but to also think about productivity gains from workplace wellness. And this requires a fundamental shift in thinking towards the strategic business advantages to organisations of implementing policies and practices that support mental wellness in the workforce. So things like enhanced creativity, innovation, increased work engagement, and job satisfaction as key drivers of performance and productivity. So what can organisations gain by focusing on the well-being of their staff and positive outcomes? We then heard Louise focus on the challenges of implementing workplace mental health intervention. She provided a very interesting case example. We know that intervention implementation can be challenging in some contexts, and organisations need to fully consider and reflect on these sorts of challenges up front, put strategies in place that are based on best research evidence and the recommendations that are going to arise in due course from this series of studies. Louise also talked to us about a range of barriers to mental health intervention and practice, but what was particularly notable in this list was the key role that line managers and leaders play in creating a culture that values health and well-being of employees and embeds this across the organisation through all practices and procedures. And this was demonstrated by my own series of studies funded by the Productivity Institute that was aligned with this work, working closely with Juliet and Chira Arthur. And our research highlighted patterns across organisations in line manager training provision and identified sectors where there's gaps in the provision of line manager training that could be targeted for future intervention. And our research, to our knowledge, was the first to demonstrate a clear relationship between training line managers in mental health to raise their awareness, knowledge and skills related to supporting mental health at work and business outcomes like retention, recruitment, long-term sickness absence and presenteeism, for example. And all of this has led us to thinking about the corporate climate for health and wellbeing at work. And coming back to managers and leaders, we know that management values related to mental health at work are linked to both employee wellbeing and to productivity. And Juliet presented to you the new Support Business Values Framework that has 7 key business values. And her presentation really emphasised the importance of adopting a values-driven approach to integrating and embedding workplace mental health and wellbeing. Our research has identified a number of challenges to implementing this framework and highlighted a gap between the values espoused by organisations and their practical implementation. So a key actionable step for organisations is to consider further how this framework could be implemented across all interactions and processes within an organisation. So in the interactive Q&A, you've had a bit of an opportunity to get the thoughts of our experts. But in brief, the framework that Juliet presented focuses on a number of areas. The overarching actionable steps from all of this work is to focus on the productivity gains of workplace wellness in the business case for investing in mental health at work, and to consider upfront the potential barriers and challenges to implementation of workplace mental health interventions, and to use best evidence to put strategies in place. And finally, to promote and apply the Support Business Values Framework when it's ready and released to ensure that mental health and wellbeing is embedded in everything we do, which is a key point that's come up here in the Q&A. The Support Business Values Framework, as Juliet mentioned, has several elements, one of which is the creation of psychologically safe work environments where people feel free to speak up about concerns and reflect on mistakes as continual learning in practice. This means creating space for new ideas, making constructive debate part of the norm, making intentional efforts to promote dialogue and celebrate small wins. And the framework tells us we should be increasing understanding by fostering an empathetic and supportive leadership, with one example being to train line managers in mental health, because we know that works and it can increase knowledge, skills and competence to support mental health concerns at work. The framework guides us to be people-focused, ensuring that everyone's voice is heard and that people feel respected, included and valued. Another key area of this framework is to protect and promote health through providing tailored support, perhaps through regular check-ins, consideration of job demands, so there's been conversations around workload in the Q&A that are relevant here, and leading by example is of course key. And the framework advocates open and regular conversation, which means that leadership needs to be approachable and responsive to allow this to happen, and that's threaded through all of the conversations today. One key aspect of the framework is to advocate rest and recovery, and we recently completed a couple of pieces of research that are relevant here. The first shows that our digital connectivity to work outside of working hours can impact negatively on work-life conflict. The second piece of research shows that employees who are better able to detach from work during non-working hours have better mental health outcomes over time. So we agree that advocating work-life balance and modelling this within the leadership becomes really quite important for workplace mental health. And the final aspect of the framework, of course, is transparency and trust, which is critical to fairness and integrity at work, which involves upholding consistent management practices, having clear channels of communication, seeking input from the workforce on policies and practices to ensure all voices are considered. So in conclusion, addressing mental ill health at work is really high on the agenda. The Gallup New Wellbeing Report is out and it shows that mental health remains at a decade-long low. The number of employees who feel their employer cares about them is down, with only 1 in 4 feeling valued. So today we've come together to focus on the positives and discuss ways in which we can take collective action to address this and ensure that current and future generations can flourish at work, particularly important in that context of the changing nature and the fast pace of the changing nature of work. It's been an absolute delight to have been able to provide some concluding remarks for this event, which leaves us with a lot of things to think about. And I'll now hand back to Juliet to wrap up.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. What a wonderful summary. I'm hugely impressed at both the detail and the integration of really what's been, I think, an interesting but very kind of complex set of ideas and considerations of where are we today, where do we need to go tomorrow, and how do we kind of co-create and facilitate that collectively together. Maybe I'm not sure if it's possible to put the, oh, there we go, oh, concluding remarks. So I want to thank you very much, both for our delegates who were able to join us here in the Business School today, also for our virtual attendees. If you have 2 seconds to fill out a really quick feedback form for us to get your thoughts, views on today's event, that would be absolutely fantastic and very much appreciated. After that, I'd like to welcome you to have another tea or a coffee. We'll have a couple of sort of biscuits out, so please feel free to stay around, to network. It'd be lovely to hear your own reflections, your own experiences, and to thank you very much for your time and effort in terms of engaging with this event and providing us with thoughts, views, and feedback. So thank you very much. And we'll conclude there. Thank you.